This podcast was produced by Mark Peace of Manchester Metropolitan University. Please feel free to use it for non-commercial purposes without seeking further permissions, under the share-alike clause of the Creative Commons licence. Once upon a time, there lived a group of early scientists called the Alchemists. Learned intellectuals based in the Arabic Peninsula, the Indian subcontinent and across Western Europe, they were unified by a single noble aim: the hunt for a mysterious hypothetical ingredient which could turn base metals such as lead into valuable gold and silver. The 700-year search caught the popular imagination, where their goal became known as the Philosopher's Stone. Beyond legends of discoveries obscured or suppressed by secret societies, no such artifact was ever produced. But beyond the legends, something very real was achieved, in the establishment of the principles and working practices of modern chemistry, and all of the contributions it was eventually to produce. We in education have our own Philosopher's Stone, our own single unifying quest. We too seek that magical transformative ingredient. Though our substance isn't metal or alloys, but minds. And the transformation that we seek is not a material one, but conceptual. It's that thing that we call learning. The various theories of learning exist as artifacts of this search. They each provide a set of ideas and propositions about the key ingredients and combinations which transform learning. In this podcast, I set out to introduce you to a sample of these theories, and provide a rudimentary grounding in some key perspectives on learning. In exploring them, though, we should remember that they, like the alchemists, seek something vaguely mythical. That single idea which describes and unlocks learning in reality probably doesn't exist. Rather, learning is something complex, individualistic, and multifaceted. But this is not to say that our quest is entirely without purpose. Each perspective has, in its own way, exposed some reality around the processes by which learning sometimes occurs, and thus brings with it useful implications for the educator. The search for the true meaning of learning is age-old. In Western culture, for instance, it's notable in the work of the Greek philosophers, where it was caught up in broader discourse on the nature of knowledge and understanding. Plato, for instance, established a principle that learning occurs within the individual, through their systematic and reasoned thought and reflection. This notion was taken up by Socrates, who injected the need to go beyond singular introspection and into a dialogue whereby another person interrogated and probed one's reasoning. Elsewhere, Aristotle laid the foundations of empiricism, with a notion that understanding came not from introspection, but from systematic observation of the outside world. In their own ways, thinkers such as these established conventions, not just on the nature of subjects, but of knowledge generation and hence the nature of learning. Through the early and Middle Ages, notions of what learning was were constituted by the governing interests invested in education. In their intent to build the infrastructure of empire, for instance, the Romans established most strongly the tradition of apprenticeship, of learning that was constituted through the close observation of activity by a more masterly other. As the Church gained dominance through the Middle Ages, education became about the dissemination and maintenance of key dogmas, and this shaped constructs of learning towards a sense of rote recall and repetition of core texts. This was challenged through the Renaissance and Enlightenment, where, inspired by a new spirit of scientific inquiry, learning received a new emphasis on discovery and an active process of generating understanding rather than just receiving it. In turn, this open-endedness was curtailed through the technical demands of the Industrial Revolution, which brought with it a renewed interest in learning governed by functional outcomes and capacities. There is then an age-old debate over the nature of learning, much of which predates the modern era of universal schooling. The treatment offered so far offers two key triggers for thought. Firstly, it demonstrates that learning is often a contested process, with perceptions of its very nature shaped by outside demands and expectations. Secondly, it suggests that learning is historically specific. What counts as appropriate is shaped by broader social and economic conditions. A mindfulness of these two facets is perhaps sensible in our continued exploration of learning theory here. It reminds us that our particular Philosopher's Stone is not one thing. Rather, it means different things to different people, in different times and contexts. The time and context we occupy now is one dominated by psychology, and in the remainder of this podcast, we will focus specifically on its contribution. We should, though, be mindful that there are other aspects of our current context which shape what we see as learning. We live amongst an era of rapid globalisation, amongst a particular economic climate, and against a neoliberal, market-driven political climate. These, as much as any so-called pure theory of learning, might shape what is seen as legitimate and beneficial activity in education. Though here, we will allow these processes to take a background to the more direct theoretical expressions. The earliest attempts by psychologists to explain learning did so by applying very strict scientific principles. As such, they set out to establish controlled experiments, often involving animals placed in mazes and other apparatus to measure the extent and effects of experience. In applying this scientific method, these theories focused only on observable evidence, and thus rejected any form of attempt to speculate about the inner workings of the mind. Their understanding of learning therefore focused on the behaviours which their subjects exhibited as evidence of learning, and the conditions and responses which made these behaviours more likely to reoccur. As such, they became known as the behaviourists. The work of the behaviourists, of whom Ivan Pavlov and B.F. Skinner are perhaps most well known, is unified by a single principle: that all learning is a process of repeated association between stimuli, behaviours and outcomes, a process called conditioning. The approach suggests that by carefully and scientifically manipulating these three components, we are effectively able to program individuals into particular patterns of behaviour with increasing predictability. It is this process which they argue we know as learning. Whether this is a dog learning a new trick through the careful application of rewards, or a class learning a new French verb through chanting and feedback. The principles established by behaviourists suggest that repetition is crucial to learning, as is the careful application of positive reinforcement and, to a lesser extent, punishment. Early versions of the approach dealt with the individual in isolation, though Albert Bandura injected a social context to the approach. He suggests that learning occurs not just through direct experience, but also through the observation of others, through the imitation of behavioural models, and by seeing others rewarded and punished. The behavioural perspective offered perhaps the first coherent model of learning, and its influence remains in educational practice. But the 1960s saw a growing discontent with its principles. In part, these objections were political, and stemmed from the socially liberal trends of the time. Conditioning and shaping behaviour jarred as an oppressive mechanism of social control. Equally, objections were theoretical. Detractors suggested that, in ignoring the internal workings of the individual's psychology, the behaviourists were ignoring a fundamental aspect of what learning is. A group of alternative theorists therefore set out to develop an approach which attended to these aspects. It was based on the principle that learning was a fundamentally internal process, governed by an active individual making sense of their environment and experience. This is an approach which contrasts strongly with the model of a passive and programmable self espoused by the behaviourists. This individual, the new perspective maintained, was always an active learner, engaged not in the reception of knowledge, but in constructing new understandings by integrating experience into their existing psychologies. On the basis of this principle, the approach became known as constructivism. At the core of constructivism is the notion of schema, cognitive maps by which we make sense of our world. It is the refinement of these maps, which are often represented as hierarchical trees, which constructivists see as the fundamental principle of learning. When we are born, we begin to learn to make distinctions, initially between self and not self, and then between objects and people, between family and stranger, and so on. These divisions become increasingly complex as our existing schemas take us further and allow us to receive experience in more sophisticated ways. A numerical schema, for instance, allows us to distinguish notions of order, of odd and even, primes and non-primes, and onwards. The exact mechanisms by which schema are refined has become the business of the constructivist school, at the centre of which is Jean Piaget. Piaget's work is dealt with in depth elsewhere, but for now, it's worth paraphrasing two of his key ideas. The first aspect of Piaget's work focuses on the preconditions for learning. He argues, that no refinement of schema will ever happen unless the learner finds themselves in a state of disequilibrium. By this, he means a state by which they cannot fully understand the outside world using their existing mental maps. Once in this context, they are primed to revise and restructure their schema in order to incorporate new information and experiences and bring about equilibrium, and hence to learn something. Anybody who's taken a toddler to a farm will recognise this process. They will often point at animals and incorrectly identify them. "Look, a doggy," they yell, pointing at a cow. By pointing out the error of their identification and offering information on how to make the distinction, the adult is able to both bring about disequilibrium and allow the learner to accommodate new information to address this. The second aspect of Piaget's work holds that learning is governed by biologically determined stages of development. Thus, the reason why 6-year-old rocket scientists are thin on the ground is not just because of the quantity of their knowledge, but also the quality of their thinking, their cognitive capacity to receive and transform information. Much of Piaget's work is an attempt to document these mental stages and the capacities that they bring. Again, these are detailed more extensively elsewhere. Piaget and the other constructivists have been significantly influential in priming educators to think of their learners as active and engaged, and not just as passive vessels for the reception of content. They have inspired others to produce pedagogies which draw on these principles in order to promote learning. David Ausubel is one such thinker. His model begins with an assertion that we should start not with what we want to teach children, but with what they already know. This emphasis is a radical challenge to teachers who feel particularly that they are subject experts. But it rests fundamentally on schema theory. Unless we start at this point, the learner will have no sense of connection between new understandings and old, and they will simply forget, misunderstand, or not understand at all. In practice, Ausubel suggests that we can manage this process in a number of ways. The most important is baseline assessment, and simply getting to know classes. Beyond this, we need to manage the integration of new content in very carefully organised ways, so that we fully emphasise the similarity and difference between ideas. One way of doing this is by signalling these connections formally at the onset of teaching, using what Ausubel calls an advanced organiser, or, in prevalent popular language, the shared learning objective. Jerome Bruner is another constructivist whose contribution to pedagogy has been significant. Like Ausubel, Bruner suggests that the learner needs to be actively engaged with the process if it's to be successful. Where Ausubel places emphasis on the teacher in managing this, however, Bruner implicates the learner themselves. In his model of discovery learning, Bruner suggests that we should present students not with organised content, but with the raw stimuli by which they can discover the connection between ideas themselves. In this model, the teacher becomes a facilitator, carefully designing learning experiences which challenge the learner to solve problems, generate order, and in doing so, produce understanding for themselves. For much of its history, constructivism has been dominated by a focus on the atomised individual as a unit of analysis. This is perhaps a cultural bias, stemming from its origins in Western capitalist and individualistic societies. In this context, it's interesting that an alternative, more socially sensitive version of the approach arose independently in the communist East. Lev Vygotsky worked at the same time as Piaget. Though his influence in the West was impeded by the Iron Curtain, he has risen to occupy a similar status of dominance. In many ways, Vygotsky offers a similar perspective to the Western constructivists, with an active learner at the centre of the model. However, where Piaget sees a biological basis to progression, Vygotsky focuses instead on culture and social experience. Vygotsky's theory suggests that an individual is capable of learning to a certain extent in isolation, but through collaboration with others, they can achieve much more. Vygotsky calls the difference between individual and potential learning the zone of proximal development. Vygotsky proceeds to suggest that two key qualities are necessary features of any interaction to promote learning. The first is scaffolding, by which one individual offers cognitive support to another in reaching a particular objective, through, for instance, careful questioning. The second is subjectivity, or a difference in existing schema. Most commonly, this is interpreted as differences in ability, and as a justification for mixed ability teaching. In reality, Vygotsky's intended meaning was broader, referring to any difference in perspective. In combining different views of the world, Vygotsky suggests that both parties are able to generate new understandings, to which they would otherwise not have access. Central to Vygotsky's perspective is an emphasis on language as a mechanism in learning. On the surface, this is perhaps obvious, for talk is the medium through which interaction often occurs. However, Vygotsky sees language as something more sophisticated than a technical tool, more than just a way of conveying content. Rather, he suggests that language also brings with it the tools by which our cultures think about the world. Semiotic sets of classifications, divisions and categories, around which schema are organised. The internalisation of language, then, and growing mastery over it, is more than just a technical exercise. It is also a process of internalising culturally specific ways of thinking. The influence of Vygotsky on pedagogy has been significant, heralding a focus on communal activity in the classroom, on mixed ability work and increasing interaction. The later emphasis on language has, in recent years, seen something of an upsurge in interest, in perhaps one of the most important turns in contemporary learning theory. These theorists, of whom Robin Alexander and Neil Mercer are particularly well known, have taken up Vygotsky's emphasis on mastery of language as a facet of learning, in a dialogic turn in education. Central to this turn is an assertion that to properly understand learning, we need to pay attention to the qualities and nature of talk in classrooms. In this mode, Robin Alexander has undertaken a cross-cultural study of classroom discourse, identifying a set of common forms. These range from rote recitation through to the giving of instruction and explanation and into discussion. Alexander suggests, though, that the most powerful form of talk is what he calls dialogic talk. Here, the teacher abandons a sense of a preferred right answer, and instead encourages an open-ended conversation in which the process of argumentation is more important than the product of an argument. Dialogic teaching is marked by an attempt to probe and extend thinking in a collaborative discussion, with a focus on those themes and ideas which are initiated by the learner. In Britain, however, Alexander notes that such an approach is rare. This is not necessarily because of bad practice, but rather the constraints of context. We occupy an education system which emphasises answers, and this runs contrary to the aims of dialogic teaching. The result, according to Alexander, is a game of hunt the answer, a pattern of initiation, response and feedback, as the teacher attempts to produce the single correct idea they have in their heads amongst classes through questioning. For Alexander, such an approach pushes out the opportunity for a more productive and interrogative open dialogue. Alexander's work on teacher talk has been replicated elsewhere by Mercer, focusing on the qualities of talk amongst learners. Here, Mercer finds a tendency towards disputational and cumulative forms of interaction. The first is based on disagreement and argument, and the latter a gradual build-up of a single idea. Both, he suggests, are counterproductive, because they fail to interrogate and unpick meanings and ideas, or attend to the process of argumentation. Exploratory talk, by contrast, has the same open and interrogative qualities of dialogic teaching, and thus tends towards a deeper and more genuine form of understanding. And this brings us to the end of our cursory exploration of the nature of learning theory, a journey which began with ancient history, proceeded through each of the key eras of human society, and into the modern psychodominant era. Here, we have explored the principles of three key perspectives: the behaviourists, the constructivists, and the more recent dialogic turn. Historical tellings of this kind tend towards the illusion of a march of progress, the sense of a journey towards a definitive and proven theory of learning. In the face of this, it's worth a brief riposte to remind ourselves that we seek the philosopher's stone, a mythical, if convenient, substance. The theories explored here occur in contexts, and these shape which are seen as more legitimate and productive in as much as their inherent truthfulness or usefulness. This said, like the alchemists of old, the work of learning theory is not futile. It's generated insight in some of the ways that learning can be interpreted, and has made suggestions about practice that might be effective in educational settings. As such, an engagement with them by a critically engaged and autonomous student is always productive.